Achtung, Feind erkannt. 12 Uhr, Position halten. All aircraft, maintain formation. We're approaching the IP.
Roger that. Lead. Flak is heavy below.
Look at this main spar. It's nearly shot clean through.
Yeah, I got it. This one's gonna be grounded for a while.
If they hit this checkpoint by 0300, we proceed as planned.
And if they encounter heavy resistance here?
January 1944. High above Western Germany, the air is thin and painfully quiet. At 25,000 feet, contrails stretch like chalk lines across a pale winter sky. German pilots climb toward the sound of engines they cannot yet see. Their cockpits vibrate lightly. Oxygen masks hiss. Below them, American bombers crawl forward in rigid formation, silver shapes against cloud and snow. Then something changes. From far above the bombers, dark specks appear, not climbing, not circling. They pause for a fraction of a second, suspended against the sun, and then they fall. Not a glide, not a chase, a vertical plunge. The fighters accelerate past anything the Luftwaffe has trained to intercept. Airframes shudder. Speed needles swing beyond familiar numbers. The distance collapses in seconds. 8 machine guns open fire, the sound brief and brutal, and then the attackers are already gone, pulling out far below, vanishing into cloud and shadow. German pilots radio warnings too late. Pursuit is impossible. Engines strain. Wings threaten to fail. In their reports, a phrase begins to repeat. They dive like stones, like meteors. And in that realization, the balance of the air war begins to tilt, because the enemy has brought not just a new fighter, but a new way of falling through the sky. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a dangerous impasse. The Allied bombing campaign was no longer experimental. It was relentless. Day after day, formations of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators pushed deeper into occupied Europe and toward the industrial heart of Germany itself. Ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, rail yards, oil refineries. Targets chosen not for symbolism, but for systemic collapse. Yet every mile deeper into the Reich came at a cost. Before 1943, American bombers were forced to turn back at the edge of fighter range. Escort fighters simply could not go far enough. The skies beyond that invisible line belonged to the Luftwaffe. There, German pilots waited with altitude, experience, and the advantage of fighting over home territory. Bomber losses mounted into the hundreds. Crews were lost faster than they could be replaced. The German defense system was layered and efficient. Early warning radar detected incoming formations. Controllers vectored fighters with precision. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed to intercept altitude, then dove through bomber streams, firing cannons at close range. Against unescorted bombers, the results were devastating. By October 1943, the situation reached a breaking point. On missions like the second Schweinfurt raid, American bomber groups suffered catastrophic losses. Over 60 aircraft destroyed in a single day. Entire crews vanished. Survivors returned with aircraft shredded by flak and fighter fire. The U.S. Army Air Forces were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Precision bombing could not continue without a fighter that could go all the way. What was needed was not merely speed or agility. It was endurance, altitude performance, firepower, and survivability. The aircraft that would eventually fill that role had already been flying, but few believed it was the answer. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was unlike any fighter the Americans had fielded before. It was enormous by single-engine standards. Empty, It outweighed many contemporary fighters fully loaded. Its fuselage was thick, its wings broad. Pilots joked that it looked more like a barrel than a blade. Compared to the sleek lines of the German fighters, the P-47 seemed almost crude. Early evaluations raised doubts. It climbed slower than expected. It did not turn tightly. In mock dogfights at low altitude, lighter aircraft could outmaneuver it with ease. Many questioned whether such a heavy machine could survive against experienced Luftwaffe aces. But those judgments were made close to the ground. The P-47 had been designed for a different layer of the sky. At its heart was a massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, one of the most powerful radial engines ever built. More importantly, it was paired with an advanced turbo supercharger system ducted through the fuselage, allowing the engine to maintain power where others suffocated. Above 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt came alive. Its weight, once considered a liability, became something else entirely. In thin air, mass translated into momentum. In a dive, the aircraft accelerated with terrifying smoothness, converting altitude into speed faster than nearly anything the Luftwaffe possessed. By late 1943, American commanders began to understand this difference. They stopped trying to force the P-47 into traditional turning fights. Instead, they rewrote doctrine around altitude dominance. Thunderbolt pilots were instructed to climb above the bomber stream, sometimes far above, and wait. Their role was not to chase. It was to strike. From that height, they could choose when to engage. They could dive through enemy formations, fire once with overwhelming force, and then escape vertically, either down in a cloud or back up toward safety. German pilots, trained for sustained engagements and pursuit, would soon encounter a fighter that refused to fight on familiar terms. And as escort coverage extended deeper into Germany, the first signs of that shift began to appear. Not in headlines, but in combat reports written by men who suddenly found the sky behaving differently than before. Those reports would mark the beginning of a quiet shock spreading through the Luftwaffe. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt did not emerge from a search for elegance. It was born from anxiety. In 1940, as war engulfed Europe, American planners studied reports from Britain with growing concern. Fighters were being asked to do more than dogfight. They had to climb fast, operate high, survive damage, protect bombers. The next war in the air would be fought at altitude, against heavy fire, and for hours at a time. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief designer at Republic Aviation, responded with an aircraft built around power first, everything else second. The result was a machine structured from the inside out to endure stress, punishment, and extremes of speed. The Thunderbolt's defining feature was invisible from the outside. Its turbo supercharger sat deep in the fuselage, fed by long ducting that wrapped through the aircraft's body. Exhaust gases spun the turbine, forcing compressed air back to the engine even where oxygen was scarce. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled, the P-47 could still produce combat power. This came at a cost. The system added weight. The ducting increased complexity. The aircraft grew larger with every design revision. By the time production models reached units in 1942, the Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter yet to see combat. Pilots noticed immediately. Takeoff runs were long. The cockpit sat far back, limiting forward visibility on the ground. The aircraft felt sluggish in the climb below 10,000 feet. Compared to the nimble P-51 Mustang or the razor-edge Spitfire, the P-47 inspired little romance. But combat was about more than first impressions. The Thunderbolt carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, with a combined rate of fire that could tear apart an enemy aircraft in seconds. Ammunition capacity was generous. Pilots could fire longer from farther away and still have rounds left when others would be empty. More importantly, the airframe could absorb punishment. The radial engine lacked a vulnerable liquid cooling system. There were no coolant lines to rupture with a single hit. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire. Armor plating protected the pilot and vital systems. Stories began circulating of Thunderbolts returning with cylinders shot out, wings holed, control surfaces shredded, and still flying. American units learned this through experience, not theory. In early escort missions, Thunderbolt pilots attempted to engage German fighters in conventional dogfights. Losses followed. The aircraft was simply not built for that role. But as tactics evolved, commanders emphasized altitude discipline. Climb early. Stay high. Never surrender energy. The Thunderbolt became an aircraft that punished impatience. Pilots who dove too low and tried to turn with enemy fighters often paid the price. Those who followed doctrine discovered something remarkable. At high speed, the P-47 was stable, predictable, and frighteningly fast. In a dive, compressibility effects began to appear, the control stiffening caused by airflow approaching the speed of sound. While dangerous, these effects also limited pursuit. German fighters diving after a Thunderbolt often encountered the same phenomenon without the same structural margin. The P-47's thick wings and rugged construction allowed it to survive dives that others dared not follow. This reality filtered slowly into German awareness. At first, Luftwaffe pilots misidentified the aircraft. Some assumed it was a twin-engine fighter because of its size. Others believed it was a bomber variant. But as encounters multiplied, a pattern emerged. Attacks from above, brief bursts of fire, then disappearance. Reports described American fighters that could not be caught in a dive. Aircraft that seemed to accelerate away as if pulled by gravity itself. By mid-1943, escort range increased. Thunderbolts began appearing over targets once considered safe. German commanders adjusted interception altitudes, but the advantage had shifted. The Americans were now choosing when and where combat occurred. And for the first time since the war began, Luftwaffe pilots were facing an enemy that did not need to outturn them, only outfall them. That change in the geometry of air combat would soon define an entire phase of the war, as pilots on both sides learned that speed, altitude, and mass could be just as decisive as skill at the controls. For the American pilots assigned to the P-47, confidence did not come easily. Many arrived from training units expecting a fighter that behaved like those they had known before. What they found instead was an aircraft that demanded discipline. The Thunderbolt punished impulsive maneuvers. It did not forgive mistakes made close to the ground. And in the opening months, some pilots quietly wondered if they had been given the wrong tool for the job. But combat has a way of teaching quickly. Pilots learned that the Thunderbolt was not meant to be flown aggressively in every moment. It was meant to be positioned, placed at altitude, held back, and then released. Those who survived their first engagements began to describe a strange shift in perception. The aircraft felt heavy until it did not. Once it began to dive, it felt unstoppable. They learned to wait above the bomber stream, scanning the sky not for targets to chase, but for opportunities. A German fighter climbing toward the bombers. A formation regrouping after an attack. A moment when altitude could be traded for speed. In those seconds, the Thunderbolt became something else entirely. Veteran pilots spoke of the sensation of falling forward rather than down, of the aircraft tightening around them as airspeed built, the control forces growing heavier, the sound of the wind rising to a roar. There was no need for prolonged firing. A short burst from 8 machine guns was enough. Then came the pullout. The aircraft shuddered under load. The horizon swung violently. Blood drained from faces as G-forces pressed pilots into their seats. And then the Thunderbolt was climbing again, dragging itself back towards safety, leaving behind confusion and wreckage. Survival reinforced belief. For Luftwaffe pilots, the shock was more profound. German fighter doctrine emphasized interception, precision, and sustained engagement. Pilots were trained to climb efficiently, attack with discipline, and pursue when advantage appeared. Against earlier American fighters, this approach worked. Many Allied aircraft could be drawn into turning fights where German experience and aircraft design gave an edge. The P-47 disrupted that logic. German pilots first noticed the aircraft size. In the split second of recognition, many assumed it would be slow, heavy, vulnerable. The instinct to pursue was automatic, a habit formed by years of combat. That habit began to kill. When Thunderbolts disengaged by diving, German pilots followed and found themselves accelerating into unfamiliar danger. Airspeed climbed rapidly. Control forces stiffened. The distance refused to close. In some cases, pursuing pilots were forced to break off not because of enemy fire, but because their aircraft threatened to come apart. Combat reports reflected frustration. American fighters were described as falling vertically, escaping downward, unreachable in pursuit. German pilots began to warn one another against following these dives. Some units issued informal guidance. Do not chase the large American fighter below a certain altitude. It was a psychological shift. The sky was no longer a place of predictable geometry. Altitude was no longer just an advantage. It was a weapon the Americans wielded deliberately. At the heart of this change was energy management. The P-47 was not designed to win turning contests. It was designed to dominate the vertical plane. Altitude represented stored energy, and the Thunderbolt could convert that energy into speed with brutal efficiency. American tactics evolved accordingly. Pilots were instructed to avoid horizontal chases. They attacked from above, passed through the enemy formation, and extended away at high speed before climbing back to altitude. This boom and zoom approach was not new, but the P-47 executed it with unprecedented margins. German fighters could climb well, but not fast enough. They could dive, but not as safely. And they lacked the firepower to afford brief firing windows. They needed longer engagements to ensure kills. The Thunderbolt needed seconds. This asymmetry forced Luftwaffe pilots into defensive patterns. They began climbing higher, burning fuel, waiting longer. Fatigue set in. Escort fighters now controlled the pace of battle. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air war began to tilt. Not because the Germans stopped fighting well, but because they were being forced to fight in a space where the rules had changed. That shift would soon be felt not just in individual encounters, but across entire sectors of the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolt's most intimidating weapon was not its guns, but the laws of physics working in its favor. At high altitude, where air density dropped and control surfaces lost authority, many fighters became unpredictable. Compressibility, the onset of shock waves as airflow approached the speed of sound, could lock controls, flatten dives, or tear aircraft apart. For most pilots, these effects were hazards to be avoided. The Thunderbolt was built to endure them. Its thick wings, massive structure, and conservative stress margins allowed it to survive dive speeds that pushed other aircraft beyond safety. Pilots reported airspeed indicators winding past limits that once seemed theoretical. Control stiffening occurred, but the aircraft remained intact long enough for recovery. German fighters, especially earlier Bf-109 variants, did not enjoy the same margins. Their lighter construction and narrower wings meant that steep dives carried greater risk. Pursuit became a gamble, one that often ended with pilots breaking off rather than following the Thunderbolt into the lower atmosphere. The result was a technological imbalance visible only at speed. This advantage would have meant little without leadership willing to enforce discipline. American squadron commanders emphasized altitude control relentlessly. Pilots who descended too far in pursuit were reprimanded. Losses early in the P-47's deployment had taught a hard lesson. The aircraft demanded restraint. As escort doctrine matured, Thunderbolt units were positioned deliberately, high above bomber formations, sometimes invisible to both friend and foe below. Their mission was no longer constant engagement, but selective violence. This required patience under pressure. German fighters attacking bombers below created irresistible temptation. But Thunderbolt pilots learned that survival and success depended on waiting until the moment favored them. Leadership reinforced this mindset through training, briefing, and after-action reviews grounded in data rather than bravado. The Luftwaffe was not blind to these developments. German commanders adjusted interception altitudes. Pilots were warned against following diving American fighters. New tactics emphasized head-on attacks and rapid disengagement. But these adaptations came at a cost. Higher altitudes meant longer climbs and greater fuel consumption. Engine wear increased. Pilots arrived at the fight already fatigued. And as escort fighters remained present throughout the mission, there were fewer safe windows to regroup or recover. By late 1943, German pilots were reporting exhaustion as a constant companion. The sense of control that had once defined interception missions eroded. Engagements felt reactive rather than planned. Beyond tactics and technology, there was a moral dimension. For American crews, the presence of Thunderbolts above the bombers was visible reassurance. Escort fighters no longer peeled away at the edge of enemy territory. Protection was continuous. Losses, while still severe, became survivable. For German pilots, the sky no longer felt familiar. They were still skilled, still brave, still dangerous. But the terms of engagement had changed. The enemy dictated altitude, timing, and escape. This imbalance affected morale. Combat reports grew shorter. Language became clinical. Confidence gave way to caution. The Thunderbolt was not invincible, but it forced respect, and respect under fire carries weight. As these angles converged, technological resilience, disciplined leadership, tactical patience, and psychological strain, the stage was set for the moment when the Thunderbolt's impact would become undeniable. That moment would arrive not in theory or training, but in combat, when pursuit became impossible and the Luftwaffe realized that falling could be deadlier than climbing. The turning point did not arrive with a single announcement or a decisive communiqué. It arrived in fragments, scattered across mission logs, combat reports, and the memories of pilots who began to notice the same pattern repeating in the sky. By early 1944, American bomber formations were reaching targets once thought unreachable. Leipzig, Brunswick, Frankfurt, Berlin itself. Escort fighters were present from takeoff to target and back again. And among them, high above the bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts waited. On missions over central Germany, Luftwaffe units scrambled earlier and climbed higher, burning precious fuel just to reach engagement altitude. When contact was made, it often unfolded the same way. German fighters approached the bombers. Then the dive began. Thunderbolts fell out of the sun in near-vertical plunges. Their approach was brief and violent. A single firing pass, then immediate disengagement. In those seconds, the disparity in speed became undeniable. German pilots who attempted pursuit found their aircraft pushed into regimes they were never meant to occupy. Airspeed indicators crept into red zones. Control inputs stiffened. The Thunderbolt ahead did not level out. It continued downward accelerating smoothly, as if the air itself favored its escape. Some pilots pressed on anyway. Several Luftwaffe reports from early 1944 described dives that ended abruptly, pilots forced to pull out hard, overstressing wings, or losing control entirely. Others wrote of being left behind, watching the American fighter shrink into the haze below, unreachable. The Thunderbolt's dive was not just faster. It was safer. American pilots, trained to recognize the onset of compressibility, learned when to deploy dive recovery techniques and when to break away. Their aircraft, built with enormous structural reserves, absorbed the punishment. Many returned with rivets loosened, paint scorched, panels warped, but intact. This survivability became part of the aircraft's reputation. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts returning with entire cylinders shot out, tails shredded by flak, wings riddled with holes large enough to see daylight through, and still landing safely. Each story reinforced pilot confidence. Each reinforced German frustration. The psychological impact compounded with every encounter. German pilots began to hesitate before committing to pursuit. That hesitation cost them altitude, position, and initiative. In air combat, hesitation is often fatal. By the spring of 1944, escort fighters were no longer merely defending bombers. They were hunting. Thunderbolt units conducted aggressive sweeps ahead of bomber formations, targeting Luftwaffe fighters as they climbed. These engagements often occurred at altitude, where the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine delivered full power while German engines struggled. The result was a cruel geometry. If German pilots stayed high, they risked being bounced from above. If they dove after attackers, they risked structural failure or loss of control. If they disengaged, the bombers continued unhindered. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely. Kills were scored. Thunderbolts were lost. But the balance had shifted from parity to pressure. American mission reports began to note a change in enemy behavior. Interceptions were shorter. Attacks less coordinated. Pursuits broken off earlier. The Thunderbolt's presence above the fight exerted influence even when it did not fire a shot. Perhaps the clearest sign of change was what German pilots stopped doing. They stopped chasing. What had once been instinct, to follow, to press, to finish the fight, became a calculated risk too often ending badly. Warnings spread through squadrons. Younger pilots were advised to let the heavy American fighter go. Veterans spoke of impossible dives and unreachable speed. This was not defeat in the conventional sense. It was constraint, and constraint in the air is a form of control. As the summer of 1944 approached, with preparations underway for the invasion of Western Europe, the Thunderbolt's role would expand even further. But before it became a hammer against the ground, it had already reshaped the sky, teaching the Luftwaffe that gravity itself could belong to the enemy. That realization would soon force a reckoning, as German command faced the consequences of an air war slipping beyond their ability to dictate its terms. By mid-1944, the evidence was no longer anecdotal. It was statistical. Luftwaffe loss rates climbed steadily in areas where long-range escorts were present. American bomber formations reported fewer sustained attacks. German pilots were still engaging, but the rhythm of combat had changed, shorter, sharper, and increasingly one-sided in energy. The P-47 Thunderbolt sat at the center of that shift. In the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, Thunderbolt units intensified fighter sweeps over occupied France and Western Germany. These were not defensive patrols. They were deliberate efforts to drain the Luftwaffe before Allied troops ever touched the beaches. German pilots attempting to intercept found themselves under constant pressure. If they climbed, Thunderbolts waited above them. If they dove, Thunderbolts followed, then passed, then escaped. The vertical dimension of combat belonged to the Americans. The Luftwaffe attempted countermeasures. Some units adjusted tactics to avoid prolonged pursuits. Others emphasized head-on attacks against bombers, minimizing exposure to escort fighters. New aircraft variants were rushed into service, and existing fighters were pushed harder, flown closer to their limits. But none of these measures addressed the core problem. The Thunderbolt's dive profile removed the possibility of punishment for disengagement. American pilots could attack and leave at will. German pilots could not always choose when to follow or when to stop. Combat records from the period show increasing numbers of aborted pursuits, broken engagements, and emergency recoveries. Pilots wrote of control lockup, violent buffeting, and aircraft refusing to respond as speed climbed. Some recovered, some did not. The danger was not theoretical. In steep dives, compressibility could render elevators ineffective, forcing pilots to rely on trim adjustments or throttle changes to regain control. The Thunderbolt structure allowed pilots the time and margin to attempt recovery. Many German fighters lacked that luxury. The psychological toll was evident. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots, already stretched thin by years of continuous combat, now faced an enemy they could neither predict nor reliably punish. Younger pilots, rushed through shortened training programs, struggled even more. Experience could mitigate risk. Inexperience amplified it. By the summer of 1944, German command faced a grim reality. Air superiority was slipping away not because of a single catastrophic defeat, but because of relentless pressure applied across thousands of sorties. The Thunderbolt's role in this pressure campaign was evolving. As Allied forces landed in Normandy and pushed inland, the P-47's ruggedness and firepower made it ideal for a new mission. The same weight and strength that enabled high-speed dives now allowed it to carry bombs, rockets, and fuel for extended ground attack operations. Thunderbolts began to descend not just on fighters, but on rail lines, convoys, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. They dove on targets at treetop height, unleashed their ordnance, and climbed away under fire. German forces on the ground began to recognize the aircraft by sound. The deep, thunderous roar of a radial engine followed by the scream of a diving attack. Columns halted. Movement slowed. Daylight travel became dangerous. In the air, the Luftwaffe's ability to intervene diminished further. Fighters that once defended ground units now struggled simply to survive escort encounters. Fuel shortages worsened. Aircraft availability declined. Pilot losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. The moment of realization came not in a single report, but in the accumulation of losses and constraints. The Thunderbolt had not merely stunned German pilots with its dives. It had denied them options. And in air warfare, the side that controls options controls outcomes. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe still flew, still fought, but it no longer dictated the terms of engagement. The sky over Western Europe had become hostile territory, shaped by altitude, speed, and gravity wielded with precision. The Thunderbolt's dive, once a startling surprise, had become an accepted reality, a reminder that dominance in the air did not always belong to the most agile, but to the aircraft that could choose when to fall and when to rise. That dominance would now leave its mark on the ground, and on the final phase of the war in Europe. By late 1944, the consequences of the Thunderbolt's dominance were visible everywhere the Allied advance moved. In the air, the statistics told a stark story. Escort fighters now accompanied bombers across the full depth of enemy territory. Loss rates, while still significant, no longer threatened the viability of the daylight bombing campaign. Luftwaffe interceptions became sporadic, fragmented, and increasingly costly. The P-47 Thunderbolt contributed to this outcome not only through aerial combat, but through endurance. Thunderbolt units logged enormous numbers of sorties. The aircraft's rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage and return to service quickly. Ground crews patched bullet holes, replaced panels, and sent the same aircraft back into the air again and again. Where more fragile fighters might have been grounded, the P-47 kept flying. This resilience mattered. Every Thunderbolt that returned was one less pilot lost, one less replacement required, one more experienced flyer carried forward into the next mission. Over time, this compounded into operational stability, something the Luftwaffe increasingly lacked. On the ground, the effect was even more immediate. As Allied armies broke out of Normandy and pushed across France, Thunderbolts became flying artillery. Their dive profiles, once used to disengage from fighters, were now employed to attack trains, bridges, fuel depots, and troop columns. Rail traffic slowed to a crawl. Convoys moved only at night, if at all. German units reported constant harassment from the air. Even when no attack occurred, the threat of sudden descent forced caution, delay, and dispersion. The psychological effect was severe. Soldiers learned to listen for the sound, the distinctive roar of a large radial engine accelerating in a dive. When it came, there was little time to react. Cover was scarce. Anti-aircraft fire was often ineffective against fast-moving, diving aircraft that appeared and vanished in seconds. In this role, the Thunderbolt's earlier air combat attributes proved decisive. Its ability to dive steeply, absorb damage, and climb away under fire made it uniquely suited for low-level attack. Aircraft returned with flak holes, control cables severed, wings scarred, and flew again. For German forces already stretched thin, this constant pressure eroded cohesion. Units arrived late. Supplies failed to reach the front. Commanders hesitated to move in daylight. The air had become a persistent threat, shaping behavior even in the absence of direct engagement. In the Luftwaffe, the shift was painful. Fighter units once dedicated to interception were increasingly forced into defensive roles with shrinking resources. Fuel shortages limited training and operational readiness. New pilots arrived with minimal flight hours, facing an enemy that had mastered both altitude and aggression. The Thunderbolt was not alone in this transformation. Other Allied fighters played critical roles. But the P-47's combination of durability, firepower, and dive performance made it a constant presence, a workhorse that carried the burden of attrition. German assessments from late 1944 reflected resignation rather than denial. The air war was no longer something to be won, only managed. The goal shifted from dominance to survival, and survival under constant pressure extracts a heavy toll. As the front lines moved eastward, the Thunderbolt followed, adapting again, carrying heavier loads, flying longer missions, and continuing to exploit the same physics that had once stunned German pilots in the high sky. Those pilots, now few and exhausted, had learned the lesson too late. The enemy's greatest advantage was not agility or numbers alone, but the ability to strike and escape at will. As the war in Europe entered its final months, the P-47 Thunderbolt's role was no longer questioned. It had become indispensable. By early 1945, Thunderbolt units were operating from forward airfields carved out of mud and rubble, close enough to the front lines to fly multiple sorties a day. Their missions ranged from armed reconnaissance to direct support of advancing ground forces. The aircraft that once loitered high above bomber streams now prowled roads, rivers, and rail junctions. In this phase, comparisons with the P-51 Mustang became inevitable. The Mustang excelled at long-range escort and high-altitude efficiency. It was lighter, more agile, and economical. But the Thunderbolt brought something different: mass and endurance under fire. Where the Mustang avoided damage, the P-47 endured it. Commanders recognized this distinction and used it deliberately. Thunderbolts were sent where resistance was heaviest, into flak-filled valleys, against armored columns protected by anti-aircraft guns, against targets that demanded an aircraft capable of taking hits and continuing the mission. German forces felt the difference. Reports from ground units described repeated attacks by heavily armed fighters that could not be driven off. Anti-aircraft fire inflicted damage, but the aircraft kept coming. Bridges were cut, trains derailed, supply depots burned. Each strike compounded logistical collapse. In the air, the Luftwaffe's presence dwindled further. By 1945, fuel shortages crippled training and operations. Many aircraft remained grounded. Pilots flew sporadically, often without the support of coordinated radar or command networks that had once guided them with precision. Those who did encounter Thunderbolts faced the same reality as before: an aircraft that controlled engagement distance and escape. The dive that had once stunned them had become a constant threat, now aimed just as often at the ground as at fighters. German post-war assessments acknowledged this shift. The Allied fighter force had achieved something beyond numerical superiority. It had imposed dominance across altitude, time, and terrain. The Thunderbolt, with its capacity to descend rapidly and climb away, embodied that control. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the P-47 had flown more combat sorties than any other U.S. fighter in the European theater. Its pilots claimed thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed and an even greater number of ground targets neutralized. But numbers tell only part of the story. The Thunderbolt's true legacy lay in how it changed expectations. It proved that a fighter did not need to be delicate to be effective. That weight, when paired with power and doctrine, could become an advantage. That gravity itself could be weaponized. German pilots who survived the war remembered the Thunderbolt not as a dogfighter, but as an event, a sudden descent, an impossible escape, a reminder that the sky no longer belonged to them. And for the Allies, the aircraft became a symbol of inevitability, of pressure applied relentlessly until resistance collapsed. The war ended not with a single decisive moment in the air, but with a gradual narrowing of choices for one side and an expansion of control for the other. In that narrowing space, the Thunderbolt continued to dive and rise until there was nowhere left for the enemy to go. When the war ended, the skies over Europe fell silent in a way few pilots could have imagined in 1943. What remained were lessons written not in theory, but in experience. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not redefine air combat through elegance or finesse. It did so by proving that air superiority could be built on endurance, altitude, and control of energy. It showed that victory in the sky did not always belong to the aircraft that turned the tightest, but to the one that chose when to engage and when to leave. For German pilots, the Thunderbolt represented a rupture in expectation. Years of training had emphasized pursuit, aggression, and mastery of the horizontal fight. The Thunderbolt ignored those rules. It struck briefly, violently, and vanished downward, transforming gravity into a tactical advantage. In doing so, it denied the Luftwaffe something essential: the ability to punish disengagement. For American pilots, the aircraft demanded trust in weight, structure, and doctrine. Those who learned patience survived. Those who respected altitude controlled the fight. The Thunderbolt rewarded discipline and punished recklessness, shaping not just tactics, but mindset. In a broader sense, the P-47 marked a transition in warfare. It bridged two eras, from the romanticized duels of early fighter combat to the industrial, system-driven dominance that defined the war's final years. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, then descended to break the enemy's ability to move, supply, and resist. By the time peace came, the Thunderbolt had become more than an aircraft. It was a statement. That air power was no longer about individual contests alone, but about sustained pressure applied across time and space. That survivability could be as decisive as speed, and that sometimes the most terrifying weapon in the sky was not the one that climbed to meet you, but the one that fell without hesitation. Long after the engines cooled and the airfields emptied, that lesson endured. Because in the modern air war, the side that controls the fall often controls the future.